What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Brian Janous. Brian is the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Cloverleaf Infrastructure, with over 20 years of experience in the electricity and data center industries. This makes him the perfect person to talk to about the growth in electricity demand being forecasted by North American grid planners as they try and get ahead of several converging trends in the energy space, including the rapid build-out of AI data centers, the onshoring of new industrial capacity, and the introduction of more intermittent sources of green energy like wind and solar onto the grid. The first hour begins with a conversation about electric power and what we mean when we talk about the grid. What are the important pieces, both in terms of operating concerns like private utilities and regulatory bodies, as well as physical systems like power stations, electrical substations, and transmission lines that comprise it? How do all of these pieces come together to support the functioning of a modern economy? And what are the challenges inherent in trying to update and expand such a complex and interconnected system? In the second part of our conversation, we discuss what the planning and procurement process for new data centers looks like from the perspective of tech companies, and what sorts of opportunities may exist to invest around this anticipated boom in data center development and operations. We also discuss how a precipitous rise in electricity demand driven by a boom in data center usage without a concurrent increase in new capacity to service it could lead to substantial cost increases for households and a series of hard choices for policymakers and politicians facing angry constituents in the years to come. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this deeply insightful and educational conversation with my guest, Brian Janous. Brian Janous, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on, man. You and I have talked already a couple of times, once in private and then once on a strategy call for a company that I do consulting work for. I host calls for their senior executives and employees. And we had an opportunity to talk about some of what we're going to talk about today was more tailored to their industry and their specific needs. This is going to be more general, but it's kind of the same thing. And we're going to have a chance to get more into conversations about the electric grid, which I don't think we really had a chance to do to this extent in that conversation. So before we get into our conversation today, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you. You worked for Microsoft for, I think, 12 years before starting Clover Leaf, which is your company now. What were you doing before then, before you went to Microsoft, and how was that experience relevant to a computer company?
Well, frankly, I never thought it would be. So I started my career in electricity consulting, working with mainly large industrial and commercial consumers of energy. So think companies like Alcoa or Walmart, folks that you would traditionally think about as being, large energy consumers, either because they have, very energy intense industrial processes, or in the case of Walmart, just have lots of stores. So those were the types of companies I worked with for the almost 12 years prior to joining Microsoft. And in the mid-2000s, I started doing some work for a handful of data centers as these started to become larger, really larger commercial loads. They really wouldn't even be considered in sort of the very large industrial category at that time because they were only about 5 to 10 megawatts. And so one of those companies I started consulting for was Microsoft. And at the time, they had a handful of data centers around the country and a couple internationally. but they were still, relatively small. And then in 2011, they approached me and said, hey, we really like you to come on full time and start this energy function inside the company. And I told the person that was recruiting me that I thought that sounded like a dead end job because I don't know why a tech company would ever particularly care about energy enough that that would be a strategic function inside the company. And he said to me, listen, I really think there's something to this whole cloud thing. And I think energy is actually going to be really important to us one day. And of course, you fast forward a dozen years from there, and energy is absolutely existential for cloud and AI companies today. And you hear all the big tech CEOs talking about electricity and the electric grid. I heard Andy Jassy talking about it on their earnings call for Amazon a few weeks ago. Mark Zuckerberg's been talking about this. Everyone, Satya, of course, everyone realizes that energy and the growth of the grid is critical because electricity is the raw material of the cloud and AI business.
So how prevalent was that mindset at the time among Microsoft's competitors, or were they just ahead of the curve?
I think it was right about that time when I joined in 2011 that Google was hiring its first sort of full-time energy person. Amazon did it within 6 months of me joining Microsoft, as did Meta. So it was right about that time that everyone started realizing we're going to have to take this issue seriously. Of course, it certainly didn't have the prevalence that it has today. That took 10 years for the industry to realize how critical electricity was for that business. But it started building at that time where everyone started to see that it was at least important enough to bring someone in-house and start thinking about how they're going to manage energy going forward.
So how did your role at Microsoft evolve over that time?
Mainly it evolved in terms of, I think, scale and awareness. I started as a team of one. When I left Microsoft, we were about 100 people inside that group, focused on energy sourcing, policy, renewable energy, carbon. But the other thing is that the centrality of the issues we were dealing with to our senior executives. So I remember my boss I had many years ago tell me at some point, this is when Steve Ballmer was still the CEO, he told me, I don't think Steve thinks about energy more than about 1 minute a year. And I said to him, yeah, that sounds about right. I don't know why he would. I don't know why this would be something that would be top of mind for him. And I assure you, when I left, Satya was thinking about this a lot more than 1 minute a year. This was something that was very top of mind for him because it became clear over that time that this potential for energy to constrain the business was absolutely a critical issue for the growth of the cloud and AI business.
So since you left Microsoft, which was what, like a year ago or so?
I left in August of last year, yeah.
Right. So what are the changes that you saw in the industry that led you to want to create your own company, which is Cloverleaf Infrastructure? And what does Cloverleaf do?
So when I left Microsoft, it was really to pursue solutions around how we're going to expand the electric grid. And I didn't actually have a plan on exactly what I wanted to do. I just had sort of lived and breathed this constraint. And most critically in the sort of last couple of years. So I knew I really wanted to work on how do we unlock technology? How do we evolve regulation? How do we support not just the growth of the cloud and AI industry, but also onshoring of manufacturing, electrification of vehicles and appliances and everything that has to happen to grow the grid to support all these trends that we're seeing. And so I knew I wanted to spend more time on that issue. And what ultimately led me to start Cloverleaf is I saw an opportunity in that there is going to be a shortage of powered land in this country. When you think about, again, all those demands that we're talking about around, AI taking electricity, turning it into data, growing our supply chains here in the United States for things like batteries and solar panels and all of the onshoring that's going on, everyone's looking for the same thing. And not to mention things like hydrogen production. Again, all of this is about finding very densely powered land, and utilities are not designed to be able to build ahead of that demand. They don't build prospectively. They wait for a customer to show up and say, hey, I'd like to get X. Well, as more of those customers start to stack up, the lead times for them being able to deliver X number of megawatts get longer and longer. And so we saw an inefficiency in the market. And so what we've done is raise capital so that we can go buy land, work with utilities to upgrade electric grid, whether that's getting long lead equipment, bringing different technologies to bear, things like grid enhancing technologies and batteries. And, how can we use all these different technologies we have to, increase our inventory of powered land in this country? And so that's really what Cloverleaf does. That's why we exist.
And this surge in forecasted demand driven by expected data center use itself also significantly influenced by trends in artificial intelligence is coming at the same time as we've already had an expectation of additional demand due to onshoring of some industrial capacity. And we have the energy transition that's been a more than a decade-long trend and a desire to figure out a way to make the grid more renewable and deal with that kind of intermittent energy supply. So you have like a complex number of challenges. I want to take a moment before we continue this conversation because, the real focus of this is data centers and AI. I think that's what's top of mind for people. But I think it would be really useful to try and at least give people a schematic of what we're talking about when we say the grid. So what are the important pieces, both in terms of operating concerns like companies and regulatory bodies and physical systems, stuff like power stations or electrical substations that make up the electric grid?
Well, you're right. There's two systems at work. One is the physical system, which is the grid itself. So this is the transmission lines, the power generation. That transmission distribution is, by its very nature, a monopoly. You only have one set of power lines running to your neighborhood. You will only always have that. So that is a heavily regulated monopoly. And it's regulated by, typically at the state level. It could be at the local level if it's a municipal utility. But there's a regulatory body that oversees that approves costs, the rates you're charged. They're only allowed to earn, an approved rate of return, on that service. And then you also have the generation. A generation is largely deregulated at the wholesale level. Which means you do have competition for the generation of electricity. In some states, and locales, that's also deregulated at the retail level, which means you can choose who you're buying power from. States like Texas and Illinois and others. In other cases, you don't, where it's still vertically integrated. All of it is still regulated, even in the deregulated world, where you have a choice. There's still regulations that oversee that. And that happens at the state level in the Public Utility Commission. Happens at the federal level with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there's still a lot of regulation in this space. And those regulations are critical because they do limit or enable what utilities can and can't do. And so as I said earlier about, utilities sort of building sort of speculatively for load growth, that's really difficult for them to do because if they build something and no customer shows up, then the rest of the ratepayers bear that cost. And so their hands are, somewhat tied in terms of, how they can prepare and plan for this sort of growth.
Mm. Yeah, that also speaks to how decentralized the grid is. A quote that I remember reading in a book that you recommended to me actually was that the grid, in some sense, you have to understand it as something that grew with America. And another thing that this author also had written was that it works in practice, but not in theory. You can't see it, grasp it, or plan for the whole of it, which makes not just building, but also forecasting very difficult. How operationally decentralized is the grid, is the U.S. grid relative to other nations and territories? And how does this make everything harder from forecasting to improving efficiency and service capacity?
Yeah, as you said, it is something that has grown organically over the last 100 plus years. And so in a lot of ways, it was not necessarily master planned for where we are today. Most critically, when you think about things like renewable generation. When we started building the grid, in the early 20th century, that was not a factor to consider, which is most of the really good wind resources in the center of the country, the really good solar resources in the Southwest. But the grid didn't grow to distribute that energy, right? It grew around urban centers. It grew starting in the East Coast and West Coast and sort of connected in the middle. And those are still two distinct grids. They operate independently and separately, the Eastern Interconnect and the Western Interconnect. And then there's also a third, which is in Texas. So they have their own grid that operates independently.
But also, it wasn't initially built around central stations, right? It was actually built, you had private little mini grids, nanogrids, or whatever you might call it.
So when the grid, if you go back to really what I would say the founding of the modern electric utility was in Chicago under Sam Ensel. And so at that time, neighborhoods would have their own, power plant that would, and then these are mostly wealthy neighborhoods that would be using electric light versus gas, which was what people were using before that, or other types of combustible fuel. So in the city of Chicago, Samuel Ensel looked at this situation and said, if you start to connect all these distributed, small power plants together and start to tie these grids together, you can build much larger power plants and reduce the cost of distributing and producing electricity. And what was interesting at the time too is most factories were not connected to any grid. They had their own power plants inside the factory that was driving their processes, the belts and things that went around the factory. And so Samuel Ensel's vision was, well, if you reduce the cost enough, you can actually get all these factories to convert over to electricity. Now, it took about 30 years for that to happen because at the time, again, most electricity was used for residential purposes. It was used for transportation, things like trains, but no factory at the turn of the century, would have been using electricity. But through that vision of scale and that centralized, moving from that decentralized to a centralized model is really what created the modern electric utility.
So we're going to continue to obviously refer back to this, and there are going to be moments where you'll have an opportunity to speak to some of the unique qualities of the grid and the challenges. For example, something that we've talked about before and that I had told you I read about first in 2016 in a book written by Ted Koppel, which also I recommend. The actual initial book that you recommended to me that I read was called The Grid, but also Ted Koppel wrote a book called Lights Out, and that was about primarily the cybersecurity threats to the grid, which ironically are not actually the biggest threats to the grid. The biggest threats to the grid are things like squirrels, gnawing on wires or trees falling on electric wires. But I learned in that book that, things like large power transformers can take years to build, and we rely on complex foreign supply chains to get those parts. So it's a very complicated system, again, and it's not easy to maintain or to improve. So to get back to this sort of to the original point of the conversation, which is data centers and AI, as well as industrial onshoring and the larger thing we've been dealing with for some years now, which is renewables. What is the scope of the demand challenge being forecasted here? And how quickly has this picture changed for both end users of electricity and providers of it?
Well, it's an enormous challenge, and it's a challenge primarily because the electric utility industry over the last 15 to 20 years has seen almost no absolute load growth year over year. So it's been relatively flat. We had 100 years of growth starting from the turn of the 20th century all the way through early 2000s, and then demand flatlined. A big part of that was efficiency gains. So we saw significant efficiency gains from things like LED lighting. Lighting used to be a pretty substantial source of electricity consumption, but with the transition and the LED technology, that's reduced considerably. You also had a trend in the data center space of moving workloads from on-prem, servers housed in closets to these cloud hyperscale environments, which are substantially more efficient. So we saw something like a 15 to 20x increase in the amount of computational power over the last decade, with almost no increase in energy consumption on the whole, because you were moving to these more efficient environments. So that's the environment that utilities have been living in the last 20 years. And now you have these factors that you're referring to all sort of coming together at the same time, which is significant onshoring and growth in the manufacturing sector of this country, adoption of EVs, electric appliances, creating demand distributed across the grid. You, of course, have the continued growth of cloud and now the accelerant of AI on top of that. And you have concerns, and we haven't seen significant growth yet in this space, but things like hydrogen production, right? Using electricity to create hydrogen, green ammonia, things of that nature. So all of those things are coming at the utility industry at the same time. And there's not really a muscle memory in that industry for growth. Because again, if you've been at a utility for 20 years, you've seen almost no load growth. And now you're trying to adapt to this world where you're looking at year over year growth in your demand. And so that's creating a real challenge because there's not good processes, plans, forecasts in place to help them execute against that growth model.
So I want to have you walk us through the process of planning and procuring power for data centers, and this kind of ties into it. Before we do that, you mentioned in a previous conversation that we had about the history of internet companies and data service providers that the industry has gone through multiple evolutions insofar as data center build-out and location are concerned. The focus in the early days was on being as close to the network hub as possible, and this is where multiple internet service providers, ISPs, and network operators interconnect their networks to exchange internet traffic. And then as cloud computing began to encompass more and more internet traffic, and as that computing began to involve more and more real-time processing of critical information, data centers and the companies relying on them switched their strategies from wanting to be close to network hubs to wanting to be closer to the customers that they were servicing. What is it about the evolution of cloud computing services and the needs of data service providers that drove this change?
Well, early on, when Microsoft and others were just starting, as you noted, really the goal there was to be close to where the biggest networks hubs in the world were. And so that was places like Northern Virginia, Amsterdam, because at the time, these companies only had a few data centers. And so they were providing all of their online and cloud services in their infancy, from just a handful of data centers. So you wanted to be, close to the highway, if you will. Over time, as those data centers grew, but then also the number of data centers grew, it really became more about, serving, the latency concerns of customers. And so if you could build more data centers closer to the customer, you could provide, higher speed, more responsive services. And so that's really what the sort of trend was in sort of the late 2010s. And you saw all the big cloud providers expanding their global footprint, putting more data centers in more countries. And it was really more a race to, having as many regions, cloud regions as possible. That sort of ran its course and came really up against what we're talking about right now, which is this constraint for electricity. And as all these companies started looking at growth over the next decade, following that continued trend line of what was happening with cloud, and then started to realize the significance of AI, it became pretty clear over the last, probably say 18 months, that the most important thing was proximity to power and power infrastructure. And so that's really what drives companies today in terms of how they think about siting and the capital investments they're making in new data centers. It's really about the ability to get a lot of power very quickly and to be able to continue to scale into the future.
So the bottleneck is moving from latency or data throughput to energy?
That's exactly right.
So does that mean that we're going to see, or are we already starting to see, Amazon Web Services purchased a nuclear-powered data center. Are we going to see a move toward co-location near cheap and reliable sources of energy, in your opinion? And are we already seeing it?
We're definitely seeing a trend towards data centers siting strategically for access to power. It does not necessarily mean co-location. Co-location is one way to do that. But again, we have a very robust electric grid in this country, and it's really about finding locations on the grid where there is excess power. And so you think about the grid as a pool, and there's sort of deeper parts of the pool than others, right? You're not going to connect a giant data center in, say, downtown Manhattan, which is already constrained, right? You're going to go a little further out and you're going to find a location where there's a lot of power flowing over that system that you can tap into. The problem and where the constraint comes in is there's only so many places in the country you can do that and pull 500 megawatts to a gigawatt of power, which is what a lot of these data centers are looking for today, which is roughly a large city's worth of power. So I think the city of Seattle is about 800 megawatts, give or take. So when you talk about building a facility that can pull that much power, again, there's not that many locations that can support that without significant upgrades of the system.
Yeah, another question I'm saving for later is how the increased demand from data centers is going to impact retail usage and the prices for people, for households using these utilities? Because there's also potentially a political issue here, right? As more and more demand gets used up. And this is something we've also seen with the transition to renewables. We've seen it most notably in Europe, where they've had some issues with the wind not blowing or the sun not shining during certain periods. What else determines where you want to be located? Like, how important is surrounding temperature, sources of power generation, nuclear, hydroelectric? We've sort of been talking about point of presence and location near customer. Like, how do you rank these things?
Well, the ranking has evolved, as I said before, from, say, the primacy of fiber access to now power. So the most important thing is power, is getting power quickly and scalable. And I would say the sustainability of that power is also pretty important to these companies because they all have very aggressive climate targets. And so it is important that they have access to our line of sight to zero carbon energy, whether that's nuclear, hydro, or building new wind and solar and storage facilities. Labor is very important because these are massive facilities that require a significant amount of construction activity. So you have to be relatively close to a population center. So even though you're again, as I said before, it's not as though you're siting necessarily to be close to population. You still have to be close to a population in order to build and manage these assets, which is why you don't necessarily see data centers being built out in the middle of nowhere. They are still requiring some level of support from a labor standpoint. Temperature is not that important. A lot of people think about the cooling and how much power that might consume, but most of these facilities can be cooled simply with outside air. So they don't use a lot of mechanical cooling. It's only in probably the most humid environments where they have to use some sort of chillers, some kind of air conditioning. But these servers can handle a lot. And so I would say the vast majority I know at the very least for Microsoft, the vast majority of their data centers around the world simply use outside air for cooling.
So another question that I have for you has to do with how we're supposed to balance, or how electric utilities are supposed to balance the need for power and the net zero goals that have been kind of big drivers in the industry. This is also true for tech companies. Like, how are they approaching the sourcing of reliable power to meet their needs while adhering to these net zero goals? And what are the biggest challenges there?
Yeah, and this is a real challenge. And it's a challenge that's sort of unique to this moment of operating in a constrained environment. So over the last decade, the data centers were really able to grow and also grow their clean energy aspirations along with that growth. Part of it is because they were relatively small in sort of the grand scheme of things. So the ability to access new wind and solar resources, which were growing very rapidly at that time, not in a small part because of the commitments and the big purchases that these tech companies were making. So they were a big driver in growing, 10x, growth in the deployment of these sort of resources. And so during that time as well, they were all making more ambitious commitments to climate. And certainly around, 2020, they all made, 2030 goals to be carbon negative in the case of Microsoft, and 24/7 zero carbon, in the case of Google. And so, they all set these really ambitious targets for the end of the decade. But this was all pre-COVID, pre the supply chain disruptions that we saw as a result, pre the interconnection backlog issues that we're seeing in the electric industry today, and of course, pre-AI, before anyone was really thinking about the role that might play in load growth. So now they're sitting here almost the middle of this decade, and they're looking at all of these headwinds and these growth projections. And I do think it's starting to sink in that the ability to meet these climate targets by the end of the decade is significantly challenged, and more challenging than they ever thought it would be. Now, I will say these companies are extraordinarily committed to these targets and their climate commitments, and I don't foresee these companies walking back those commitments. However, the need for power and the desire to interconnect as many GPUs as possible to build the largest training models and the most capable inferencing that's an enormous economic opportunity for these companies. There's only going to be a few winners in this space because of the capital requirements. I mean, we're talking about, literally hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion that will go into building this infrastructure. So it's not as though there are a lot of players. I mean, every company is sort of an AI company today, or at least they seem to be, but there's only going to be a few winners when it comes to the actual physical infrastructure. And for that, you need a lot of power and you need it quickly. And so that's where the desire to capture this AI market and these sustainability goals come into conflict, because there's a time dimension here that just may not be met.
The time dimension being the urgency with which they need to build out the data centers and supply the energy, and the length of time they need to update the grid to make it capable of servicing the demand with renewable supply.
That's exactly right.
How much of that challenge has to do with energy storage? Not just in terms of storing energy when it's being produced and not being used, but also like offloading the energy so it doesn't compromise the grid.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things you can do with electricity. You can either move it through space or move it through time, right? So if I'm producing electricity at a power plant, I can move it through space by taking it over a transmission line. But if that line becomes constrained, there's only so much I can move over that line. Then I have to move it through time, and that's through some means of storage, right? So I can take some batteries, I could use pumped hydro, I can convert that into a fuel in the form of hydrogen. So there's a lot of different things that I could do with it. But that too has constraints. There's only so much, battery storage that cost effectively I can deploy today. Most of the batteries, storage capability we have on the grid is through, lithium ion, typically economically only feasible for 2 to 4, maybe 6 hours. There's a lot of new technologies that are being worked on and new chemistries that would enable us to store electricity even for days. And that could be a really critical resource as we're thinking about how we build out this grid of the future. But those aren't at major commercial scale yet, so it takes some time. And battery chemistry, historically is very challenging. We've only ever commercialized about 4 different battery chemistries. And so even though there are hundreds, if not thousands of ways to make a battery, making a battery company and commercializing a chemistry is substantially more challenging.
So I know that there's things like artificial lakes, for example, that are a way of storing energy. Why have these non-chemical solutions not been more widely deployed? Are they just very expensive? Are there just few ways in which you can do it at scale?
It's more of a geographical limitation. You're right. I mean, so pumped hydro is a means of storing electricity. So you pump the water up, when power is abundant, and then you allow it to flow down when it's not. It's a pretty great form of a battery, but it does require some form of, geology to support that. You have to have a place where you can actually pump the water up a hill, and you also have a lot of land use issues because you have to flood some land to support that, to create artificial lakes. So those sort of scales of projects can be really challenging, especially in the modern world. We were able to do this back in the 20s and 30s with the BPA here in the Northwest and build these massive dams, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's also a major project. And that was really a wartime effort to build out large amounts of energy to support Oak Ridge National Lab and what we were doing there in terms of creating the atom bomb, right? So those sort of efforts are possible, but they require sort of a wartime mentality with it we don't exactly have in this country today.
So I mentioned that I want to talk about the process of planning and procuring power for data centers, and that goes into also a larger conversation about the investment opportunities. But before we do that, I have one more question about this, which is efficiency gains. So how much of this demand can be satisfied by increasing the efficiency of use? And how much of that would come on the commercial side? How much of it would come on the retail side in terms of demand? And then how much of it is on the supply side? In other words, the power generation. Where are the opportunities for efficiency? And how important are efficiency gains in terms of tackling this problem?
So when I think about efficiency in this particular environment, there's 2 components. One is the efficiency of the data center itself. So I take electricity, I bring it into this building, there's an efficiency around how much of that energy actually goes into useful work, the actual computation in the server, versus how much of it goes to ancillary, lighting, cooling, et cetera. The modern cloud data center is extraordinarily efficient in that respect, in that the vast majority, say almost 95% of electricity that comes in goes into the server, right? And this, if you roll back a decade when most computation was happening at a environment, say, in a small data center or in a bunch of servers in a closet, it was probably something more like less than 50% of that energy went to actual useful work, and most of it was wasted, right? So we've already, going back to what I was saying earlier about LEDs, we've already sort of made the transition to these hyper efficient, what we call hyperscale cloud environments. So there's sort of diminishing returns into how much more efficient you can make a data center in terms of that power to useful work. Now there's a second order of efficiency, which is around the server itself. And so servers, of course, get more efficient over time in terms of their amount of computation you can do with the power you put in. But the problem with that is very much impacted by Jevons paradox, which says if you make something more efficient, you don't use less of the input resource. You actually end up using more of it because you actually find more means of utilizing that particular resource. And so that was at the time, when this was postulated, as these really efficient steam engines were coming out, there was a belief that the use of coal was going to plummet because now you had these super efficient steam engines. Well, the exact opposite happened. We just mechanized more things, more factories and, more processes. And so that's exactly what happens with computation, because the human capacity to consume data is still on an upward trajectory. So as long as we're moving up that curve, creating a more efficient chip only moves us faster up the curve. It doesn't bend the curve down, doesn't force the curve. So what happened with AI is, I think in a lot of people's expectations, we all knew that AI was possible, but until ChatGPT-3 was released, I don't think we all realized that what was possible today. Like we were thinking, okay, maybe we could do that 10 years from now. And now we're like, oh, we can do that now. So it's not as though we put off for 10 years those aspirations. Like, no, we're going to do that now. So we just ran up that curve faster. And we're going to keep running up that curve. Every time NVIDIA comes out with a more efficient chip, it is not going to mean that Microsoft and Meta and Google use less electricity. Rather, they're probably going to deploy more chips and provide more services with those until we reach sort of that limit of human capacity for data consumption.
So in your estimation, how far away is that limit? In other words, is this kind of like a hamster wheel that we're on? And how do we, this brings us back to the net zero goals, because it seems so often that these goals of net zero and really focusing on renewable energy growth and getting carbon emissions down is the real challenge that we constantly face, because we want to use more energy. We want to grow our economies. And if this is the dynamic, how do you see that resolving itself?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, is that when we talk about this increased demand for electricity, this is actually a good thing. We were talking about onshoring manufacturing, we're creating jobs, economic growth. All of this investment in the grid is good in that we do want to electrify more processes. Electricity is a means to accelerate decarbonization and move away from combustion as sort of the primary means of energy towards electrification. And so the whole theme behind electrify everything is great. And so it's good to see growth. It's good to see the need for investment, because that can help accelerate our decarbonization ambitions as a society. Now, there are trade-offs in the short run, though, right? As we're trying to meet this load and we have to add new generation, there's a tendency for the utilities to reflexively move towards adding gas-fired generation, because it's something that they know they can build and they can build it quickly. Integrating renewables and then balancing with storage is more complex. And so, and you have to meet the system peaks. The lights have to stay on and air conditioners have to stay on during the hottest times of the year. And they have to be on during the coldest nights of the year, right? That's critically important. And utilities, their primary obligation is to keep the power on. I mean, that's their motivation and that's the public service that they provide. So that's where this whole equation gets really challenging, is how do we continue to grow the grid, but do it in the most sustainable manner possible and make sure that, each step along the way, we're optimizing as much as we can to keep us on a path towards decarbonization.
So we talked a little bit about the history of the electric grid, and I mentioned how in the early days you had a lot of these microgrids. The central station model evolved later, and we seem to be seeing a resurgent interest in building out more of these micro or nano grids today as a way of increasing overall resiliency and leapfrogging some of the inertia that comes with needing to source electric power from utilities that may yet need convincing over whether or not demand for some of these new use cases is real, or who have to balance the needs of households with commercial customers. Is this maybe one of the paths forward, where we see more companies vertically integrating their operations to include energy production as a way of scaling more quickly because of the challenges of building capacity at a national level, given the decentralized nature of the grid?
Yes, I think being able to more intelligently optimize edge resources, if you will. And it's actually not incredibly dissimilar to computing. I mean, if you think about how computing evolved, it started centralized. It started with big mainframe computers, right? And you had to walk over to the room with the thing in it and put your punch card in there. I mean, that's what computing was. It became decentralized through, the PC, right? But that was a temporary step in the evolution of computing. It actually re-centralized through cloud computing. So most of the things that we do every day are not done on our own hard drives, right? There still is an edge component, and there's things that have to happen locally. And, computer systems are really well optimized. I mean, if I'm playing a video game or, I'm on a Zoom call, there's certain things that are happening locally, and those cloud services can take advantage of the computation that's on my computer. But the bulk of what's happening is actually happening in a centralized environment. So that trend towards centralization is very strong. And that's the same thing that's happening in the electric grid, where we're still going to have a centralized grid. You're not going to decentralize the electric grid in the sense of, we're going to disintermediate the utility. That was actually a trend over the last decade of like, oh, the whole utility model, these are dinosaurs. This is old industry. We need a new model where power is completely distributed and everyone has solar panels on their roof and batteries in their garage. And you very well may have that. But you're not going to disconnect from the grid. You're still going to utilize the services the grid provides, and you're going to provide services back to the grid. And that's where the evolution of the industry is that sort of two-way model where you can be both a consumer and producer. It doesn't change the sort of the function of the grid in terms of being ultimately the balancing authority.
Right.
But it does offer opportunities to more strategically optimize, day by day, minute by minute, how the load actually gets served.
Now, is Hawaii, I know that Hawaii, I think was at the forefront of solar installations. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes.
Didn't they get to a point where they forbade anyone from actually connecting to the grid with their panels because they were so overloaded with intermittent energy production from solar panels that it actually overloaded their grid?
Yes, and this is why I say, we were talking earlier about the importance of regulation. This is still a regulated market. You still have to have guidelines on what gets connected and when. And this is the challenge that I mentioned before about this interconnection issue, is that you can't just have anything connect whenever it wants, because it does change power flows on the grid. Utility have to study how additional power generation over here or an additional load over there will influence the load flows on the grid. And again, it's all about reliability and uptime. And so there always has to be regulations and limits to, how the grid evolves. And that creates challenges, particularly in a time of rapid growth, because it's very difficult for utilities to anticipate how these changes are going to evolve over time. And that's what creates some of the constraint and backlog we're dealing with today.
So this is kind of a technical, possibly stupid question, and it may not be sort of economically feasible, but I have solar panels on my roof and I also have a generator. Now, the problem I have is that I can't actually operate those panels off the grid. I have to be connected to the grid because I have to have a place to offload the energy. Unless I had a battery, maybe. But from what I've been told, there isn't even a software system or a service provider there isn't any kind of software that allows you to kind of manage all those different parts on your own sort of home grid, like your generator and your panels, so that if I were to go off grid, I could use my panels for as long as the sun is out, and then I can switch to the generator when it isn't. I mean, do I have that right? Or like, is it that there are things like that, but they're for commercial customers, and so they're so expensive that you can't really get them as a household? And then is there an opportunity there to more efficiently manage the renewable supply that's produced by households or with their generators or whatever it is on their little microgrid, if we want to use that term, that actually makes the larger grid function better?
There absolutely is. I mean, and when you think about, the solar panels on your house or even the, battery or generator that you have, I mean, those things are still part of the grid, right? You have power flowing, in and out of that system all hours of the day. And so you are just an edge component of this much larger system. In most cases, you're not, as you were sort of alluding to, sort of islanded from the grid. You could be. I mean, you could disconnect from the electric grid and have enough solar on your house and enough battery storage, but that's not an optimal solution. You actually want those assets to be connected to the grid because you get valuable services from the grid, and you also provide services to the grid. When you're producing more than you're consuming, so there's real value there in that interconnection. And so, the only time you really take advantage of that islanded system is when there's a power outage, right? I mean, the whole reason you would have a generator is if there's a big storm, a hurricane comes through and power's out, you want to be able to keep your refrigerator running and some sort of critical aspects of your own power needs. But for the most part, like keeping those systems connected to the grid is a really good thing.
Does the increased prevalence of electric vehicles, like we're not here, we don't have the same trend here in the US as we do in China, but like with EVs coming more and more online, and you have these batteries in the home that are charging, let's say, especially if you have solar panels, but they can be charging in the evenings also from the grid. How does that actually make the grid potentially more renewable?
Well, the trend towards EVs is, again, in and of itself, a good thing from a sustainability standpoint because you're moving away from combustion to using electricity, which is a far more efficient means of moving a vehicle. And of course, that electricity over time is getting more sustainable. And so that's partly why EVs are such a significant thing when we talk about decarbonization more society-wide, because we know how to decarbonize the electric grid. We know we can get to every year a higher percentage of zero carbon resources. And certainly some parts of the grid are already a lot cleaner than others. I live in the Northwest. We have a lot of hydro here. So it's one of the lower carbon area of the grid. There's other parts of the grid that are still higher carbon, but either way, it's still, a net good to make that transition. And of course, as the cost of deploying things like rooftop solar go down, we're going to see more of that, more adoption in more places. The efficiency of the panels go up. It's not incredibly efficient here in the Northwest because of our weather patterns, but over time, those panels get more efficient and can produce more even in, cloudier environments. And so you're going to see, more adoption and deployment of that.
So Brian, I'm going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed, where we're going to have a chance to dig into the planning and procurement process for new data centers from the perspective of tech companies and what opportunities exist to invest around this anticipated boom in data center development and operations. Also, the politics of data center usage is something that I want to discuss because it seems that we could end up in a situation where the demand for electricity goes up precipitously before utilities have had a chance to build out new capacity, in which case prices could rise, in some cases substantially for households. And that could have real ramifications for lawmakers who are dealing with angry constituents. Who's going to take the fall in that case? I wonder, for example, what effect this could have on Bitcoin mining or other proof-of-work blockchains that are very energy intensive. This is something that you and I have talked about before and that you have some very strong opinions about. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Brian head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Brian, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.